So picking right back up from where we left off, talking about stereotypes and sociotypes, I want to get into equity and equality. So let's look at these first. And so in discussions about diversity, inclusion, and education, equity and equality are often used interchangeably, but they actually represent very different philosophies of fairness. And so in order for us to build culturally responsive schools, or even workplaces, we need to understand and act on that distinction between the two. So let's look at equality first. Equality means giving everyone the same resources, opportunities, or treatment, regardless of their individual differences or circumstances. And it's based on the idea that everyone starts from the same point and that fairness is achieved by treating all people the same way. So in this, every student gets the same textbook, the same number of minutes with the teacher, and the same homework. Every school in a district receives the same funding per student, regardless of the student need. And this is like the classic example, the fences and boxes. So when we talk about equality, everyone has the same box, right? So they're all standing behind the fence watching the baseball game. But as we can see, yeah, they're all equal, but are they really fair? So it's a limitation, equality is, and it sounds fair, but in practice, it really ignores the structural inequalities that affect students' ability to benefit from those equal resources. So if two students start at very different points due to poverty, language barriers, racism, or disability, equal treatment can actually reinforce the inequality. So equality focuses, again, everyone gets the same thing, while equity focuses on the outcome. Everyone gets what they need in order to succeed. So equity means providing each student with the resources and support they need to achieve comparable outcomes. It recognizes that students have different starting points and that systemic barriers affect their access to opportunity. So equity in education, it's not about sameness, it's about justice and responsiveness. One example is like English as a second language, right? Or ELL, English language learners. When you come into college, for example, and you can't read or write in English, you're going to take courses that help you read and write in English to kind of get you up to the starting line, right? You're a couple of steps behind the starting line. We need to get you to the starting line so that you can actually start and finish your education. Schools serving low-income communities, they might receive extra funding for technology or counseling or tutoring. Another example would be teachers differentiate instruction based on readiness, interests, or cultural backgrounds. And discipline policies are re-examined to address the racial disparities, like in suspension rates. So when we look at an equitable classroom, educators intentionally adapt their methods. They adapt their resources and their expectations to meet those diverse student needs. So again, everyone has a different starting point, but we're trying to get you all to the same starting point. So like in this picture over here, this person they were tall enough to see over the fence. They didn't need a box to stand on. This next person, one box was enough, right, in order for them to be able to look over the fence. But this person here, they needed more resources. They needed more boxes in order to stand over the fence to see what was going on. So this is what equity looks like. This is when you're given the resources that you need in order to be successful. And when we talk about justice, this is going beyond equity. Justice is doing a little bit more. It's looking at what is the root cause of that inequality? What is the fence? Why is that fence there? Why do we have a certain barrier? Can we remove it? Can we take the fence out so that we don't need all those resources? So if the barrier is eliminated altogether, then we see a change in our system. We see a systemic reform. So the analogy, it does highlight that equal treatment, it does not guarantee equal opportunity, right? In the equality side of the picture. So when we're looking at like what can we do? How can we change? How can we fix it? You need to recognize that there are going to be barriers to equity. So even with the best intentions, schools and workplaces really do struggle to achieve equity due to like the things that we've talked about, the institutional racism, the implicit bias in teaching, discipline, and grading, the cultural mismatch between school norms and students' home cultures. It is like if we were to go to Four Corners and we put in all white teachers, an all white curriculum, and an all white expectation on the reservation. That's not going to work. Why would you do that? That makes absolutely no sense, right? Boarding schools try to do that, and thank goodness we've gotten rid of boarding schools. But that's a cultural mismatch. A lack of representation in curriculum, leadership, and decision making. Why would you put an all white school in the middle of an Indian reservation with all white teachers? You need people from that group, you need Indigenous people teaching at those schools, right? And then also within education, there's a lot of resistance to change. It's sometimes equity is misinterpreted as unfair or lowering the standards. Well, it's really not. It's trying to meet students where they are. So what equity looks like in the classroom. Teacher behaviors, and I'm sorry, I know this is a lot on one slide, but differentiating instruction for diverse learners, right? Building relationships with families to understand the student context. You walk into a classroom, you walk into first day of work and you meet someone, you don't know their background, you don't know their story, you don't know anything about that student. You may not even know that student, English is actually their third language. You need to build those relationships beyond the classroom in order to understand the student context. Checking personal bias when interpreting student behavior, like check yourself, in other words. Creating classroom norms collaboratively and inclusively. Using formative assessments to guide equitable learning opportunities, like formative assessments meaning do not rely on one assessment. Exams are great, but that is relying on one assessment. You need to do other things because not everyone's a good test taker, right? There's the stereotype that Asians are good at test taking. What about everyone else in our classroom if we're going to go off that stereotype, which we should not? But don't just do one type of assessment. Do different types of assessments to highlight student strengths, because they may be horrible at pen and paper, but they could be really good at having a conversation with you and telling you the correct answers instead of writing them down. Also, curricular practices, including diverse authors, perspective, and histories. We're going to do that later in this class. We're going to bring in diverse materials from all backgrounds. Connecting content to students' lived experiences. Right? Encouraging multiple forms of expression and assessment, like I just pointed out, doing like a conversation instead of a pen and paper. Provide scaffolds, not simplifications, but you're going to lay the foundation and then we're going to build on that foundation. Then once we get that first level after the foundation, then we're going to build a second level and we're going to make it until we can get to the top, right? But we have to lay the groundwork first. And then school-wide systems, analyzing data for disparities in achievement, discipline, and participation. Like, why are white students more successful? Well, they have access to more things. Right? Like we need to look at that and figure out, okay, let's make sure that everyone has access to the same things, to the same technology, to the same textbooks. Implementing targeted supports for historically marginalized groups. Historically marginalized groups in the U.S., it's going to be our groups of color. It's going to be Indigenous students. It's going to be Latinx. It's going to be African American. It could even be women. Think about it that way too. Ensuring access to rigorous coursework for all students, and then allocating resources strategically, not uniformly. So the key takeaways that I want you guys to take from this is, let's look at bias. So bias and discrimination operate through personal attitudes and also systemic policies. So individual racism that we talked about shows up in personal beliefs, assumptions, or behaviors, such as teacher expecting less from students of color. Flip side, institutional racism, actually it's not the flip side, it's just like more like systemic, more in the system of institutional racism. It's embedded within school structure, policy, or traditions. So unequal access to advanced courses, Both levels reinforce each other. So personal biases sustain institutional patterns and institutional norms validate that individual prejudice. And just being able to recognize both forms, like recognizing your own biases, it's really essential for meaningful educational change. Cultural bias also shapes how educators interpret student behavior. So look at your own cultural and just know that it is, yeah, it's normal for you, but it's not normal for everyone else, nor is it superior to other cultures. And in schools, it can really lead teachers to misjudge students who communicate or learn differently. Stereotypes or oversimplified ideas about groups, and that can really limit your expectations and opportunities when you're interacting with these other groups. Sociotypes, socially informed generalizations, they can guide awareness, but be very careful if you're going to use them, and don't, just have a fixed assumption about groups of people. Culturally responsive educators really challenge stereotypes, and they seek cultural understanding and reflect on their own biases. And equity doesn't always mean equality. True fairness means giving each learner what they need, not treating everyone the same. So equality treats all students identically, assuming everyone, starts from the same place, or that they all need the box in order to see over the fence. So equity provides those boxes to students who do need it to see over the fence, and really provides resources, opportunities, and supports tailored to different needs and starting points. Equity ensures, comparable outcomes by acknowledging and addressing those barriers that students have, not just ignoring them or pretending that they don't exist, but actually, this is a barrier. How do we get you over that barrier? How do we get you to, maybe we can't knock the fence down, but as in that picture showed, how can we get you to see over the fence, over the barrier, so that you can start? And then change starts in the classroom. It starts in the workplace. It starts on an individual basis. It starts through reflection, advocacy, and culturally responsive practice. So you can influence how inclusion and fairness are lived out daily. You can build relationships that, recognize diverse identities. You can use curriculum in the classroom that represents all voices and perspectives. You can advocate in the classroom and at work for fair discipline, access, and opportunity. You can challenge the bias systems and support reform. So inclusive educators and workers don't just teach about diversity, they practice it. And ultimately, education becomes a force for social justice when it empowers every student to thrive. So think about that. Think about everything that we've discussed that I've discussed at you in these videos, and really go in with an open mind as you are reading through the next case study about institutional racism at a made-up high school, but that's going to be your case study that you're looking at for this week.